Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of August 2024. And once again, summer reading is winning, and I had over 40 books that I was able to read this past month and some really good ones on this list. So let's dive into what I was able to get read. The first book that I read for the month was one of my Alphabet Challenge books, and it's called How to End a Love Story by Yulin Kuang. And this is basically about two main characters, a man and a woman who knew each other when they were younger, and they end up in a writer's room for a television show that's based on the book of the female main character. And the male main character happens to be like a television writer. And I will just say I had a hard time connecting with these like main characters, and they had a situation which I think is a bit of a spoiler in their past, which like caused them to have a bit of a rift, total understandable rift. But like the way that they come back together, I don't know, like I just wasn't connecting with it a whole lot. That said, I know of a ton of other people who've really loved this book. So I would say if you're kind of interested in that kind of like, it is like an enemies to lovers, you know, kind of trope, you might pick it up. Then I read a bunch of nonfiction all in a row. I read a book called Do Hard Things by Steve Magness. And this was actually, the next several books were books that I was like working through. I had a list of books that I had gotten from my local library. And so I was trying to kind of like read through a bunch of these so I could return them. So this falls into that category. I actually really liked this book. The subtitle is Why We Get Resilience Wrong and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. I liked the range of examples that this author had in the book, and there were several things that I took away that I just thought were really interesting kind of for my own resilience practice, so would highly recommend that one. I then read a book called Creative Endurance by Mike Schnate, and subtitle is 56 Rules for Overcoming Obstacles and Achieving Your Goals. This book, the highlight of this book for me was its design. This is built or kind of designed by a man who's got like a background in like magazine design. So it looks like that. It kind of looks like a magazine, and it has these kind of like print and like artistic elements to it that were really fun. The content was also interesting, but like I actually really liked the way that the book was designed more than anything else. Then I picked up a book called All It Takes Is a Goal by Jon Acuff. I have read a bunch of other books in Jon Acuff's backlist. He has a book called Finish. He has a book called Quit, I think. There's a bunch of different ones. And this one of the things that I really enjoy about Jon Acuff is he's like a comedy writer. And so he infuses his own kind of like tone and humor into the book. Tons of great examples. I took away a lot of interesting ideas around goal setting. And I would actually really recommend this book. I think it has like a fresh take on goal setting that was really interesting to me. Okay, then I picked up Andrew Leland's The Country of the Blind. This is a memoir by the author who has been diagnosed with an illness that I'm not going to be able to remember exactly what it is, but he talks about it in this book, where he is going blind over time. And he started to go blind kind of earlier in his life, and as an adult, it's getting progressively worse. And so in this memoir, he basically begins to explore the blind community and kind of understand the culture of the blind community. And he goes to several events and kind of starts to interact with this community in a different way. I found this really fascinating. I mean, I think that whenever you are entering into a culture or a community as an adult that you like were not raised in that community, and you're trying to understand like the nuances of that community as basically an outsider, but someone who's like becoming an insider just based on your circumstance, like what an interesting approach, you know, to this memoir. So I thought it was really interesting. Then I picked up a book by Jennifer Heiss called Move the Body, Heal the Mind. This is subtitled Overcome Anxiety, Depression, and Dementia and Improve Focus, Creativity, and Sleep. This is a book that I would say is a nice mix of like the author's personal experience and science. You know, she's kind of bringing a lot of different things together in this particular book. I will say I resonated more with the science part, you know, than with her kind of personal story. And I thought that the studies and things that she was referring to were probably the strength, you know, of this particular book, but I thought it was interesting. Then I swapped over to fiction, and I picked up a book by Freida McFadden called The Inmate. And I've never read a book by Freida McFadden, but this is an author who I think like I've just seen around, and I was just kind of like intrigued. I'm like, what exactly is like the style of this writer? Like, what can I expect? You know, because it seems to be someone who's pretty popular. And this is a book that I will just say has horrible reviews by some people. Like, people are like 1 star out of 5. Like, they're just like completely not jiving with this book. Like, it is not something they enjoy. And then other people are like, this was amazing, 5 stars. So it's very bifurcated in terms of how people feel about this. I can see why people like the book. It's kind of a page turner. It's definitely got kind of like some thriller vibes to it. The general plot of this book is there is a man who is in prison. I think he's on like death row. And he was put there by his high school girlfriend, in part, like she was one of the witnesses of like this crime. And then she goes and works in the prison as like a nurse, and she doesn't tell anyone that she like knows this guy. And I will say the thing that I think gets it the 1 star is that she just makes some really unfortunate choices where you're just like, what are you doing? Like, this does not feel smart. Including this concept of like going to work in a prison of this killer that you put there. I mean, like, it doesn't feel like the most smart thing that you might do. So I got like both sides. I could see like page turner. I could see, you know, the 1 star. I probably landed somewhere in the middle. I might pick up something else by this author just because I think it's kind of like, I would consider this to be like a plain read. Like, it's just something you can kind of turn the pages and read relatively quickly. Okay. The box set that I picked up for the month of August was the Last Survivors box set by Susan Beth Pfeiffer. The first book is called Life as We Knew It. And then I read the other books in this box set throughout the month. This is a story that is based on the concept that like basically an asteroid, I don't even know if it's an asteroid, something hits the moon and it kind of like knocks it off kilter. And it starts to impact things on Earth because the moon has like shifted its orbit a little bit, or its course. I'm not going to fully understand the science here. The books don't really go into the science. I'll just mention that. But basically what happens is you have like this kind of apocalypse scenario where everybody's like running to get supplies, they're hunkering down, like there's this family that you're following, and they're in I want to say like Pennsylvania, and they're trying to kind of like live through this experience. YA dystopian fiction. The second book in the box set takes place in an entirely different place, but it's the same timeline. So it's a group of siblings in New York that are experiencing the same situation and like what happens with them. Book 3, you've got those 2 families coming together. They end up being in the same geographical location in book 3. And then in book 4, it like speeds forward like 5 years. And then you have like a younger sibling, you know, from book 1, like having more of a storyline. I'm really sorry to say, book 1 was the best of the 4, and they get progressively worse as you go on. And the reviews say the same thing. Like, if you read reviews for these books, and especially book 4, people are not kind about like what is happening in book 4. I did read all of them just because I wanted to like, you know, check this off my list, and I had committed to doing it. But the beginning of book 1 was actually kind of interesting. I was like, oh, this is an interesting premise of like, where could this go? It reminded me of a book by Karen Joy Fowler. I think I'm getting that author right, where she had written a book kind of similar, like what would happen if like, I think it was like the Earth's orbit started to slow, you know, like what would be the things that would result from that? I'll put a link to I'll put a picture of the book in the video just because I'm not sure. I can't remember the title. I want to say it's like Age of Miracles or something, but I will find it and put it in the video. That it reminded me of that. It wasn't as good quality, but like this concept of like what if, like what would happen? And I was like, I'm willing to go along with that. But the further along you get into the box set, the characters just like, again, not making the best choices. It's hard to get behind anyone, and it's you kind of lose hope like as you go along with how the story is progressing. So it's rare that I would say, you know, like I'm not sure to pick this one up, but I would say since it's 4 books and it's kind of an investment, I mean, they're not short, you know, like by the time it's probably 1,000 pages, you know, altogether, maybe more. I don't know that I would encourage you to pick this one up. Maybe read the first one, and like if you want to, or if you're like super curious now that I've described it this way. But I can't put my like full recommendation behind that one, unfortunately. Okay, Then I picked up another nonfiction. This is one that I own that I've just wanted to read for a while. It's called Settled in the Wild by Susan Hand Shetterly. The subtitle is Notes from the Edge of Town. And this is basically just like, I would say it's like a combo of like a memoir and like a nature book. And I tend to like these kinds of books. Like, I feel like they are a palate cleanser, you know, in the midst of a lot of other things I read, and they kind of just slow me down. They're usually a little bit poetic. And this one definitely fell into that category. Okay, then I picked up a book called Divergent Mind by Janara Nierenberg, and this is subtitled Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You. This is primarily, it's kind of a mix of like a memoir and a bit of like a social commentary on women in particular who have autism. And I had started reading this book a while back, and I had like dipped into it, and then I set it aside and I came back to it. And the first time was on ebook, and then I listened to it on audio. I would say that this is pretty similar to some of the other things that I've read, but there are some other books on women with autism, and the one that I would point to here is Devon Price's Unmasking Autism, which I would recommend more. Because I think that Devon Price's book is just more nuanced in terms of its approach, and it talks a lot more clearly about like intersectionality and autism, which I thought was really interesting. So I'm starting to get a little bit of an understanding now that I've read more broadly, you know, in this area of kind of like what I think is better to recommend, you know, to people who are starting to do like a deeper dive on this topic. Okay. The next book that I read is a book called The Ideal Life: 7 Steps to Harness Your Stress, Discover Your Purpose, and Achieve Your Goals by Mark Congdon. There were definitely some things in this book that I appreciated. In particular, the author kind of pulls apart different kinds of goals, and he talks about how you can like separate them out. And it reminded me a little bit of like the Jon Acuff book in terms of like defining like different like longer term goals, horizon type goals, milestones, things like that. I thought that was interesting. The challenge for me with this particular book is there are a couple places in the beginning it's pretty light, but in the end it comes in very heavy of like an evangelical Christian message, which I can respect the author doing that and feeling like that's important, but it kind of came out of nowhere, and I was like, oh, like that's what, like this is like taking a turn, and I wasn't expecting that, and maybe I didn't read the description closely enough. That's totally possible. But that was a bit of a turnoff for me, because I think up until that point, I was like, yep, I'm tracking, this makes sense. And then I felt like the author just like, I don't know, like taking advantage of me as a reader is probably too strong of language, but it felt like now that you're here, I'm gonna like give this other pitch. And I was taken aback by that. But there was other content in this book that I thought was helpful. And if you don't mind the evangelical Christian pitch, then this might be a book for you. Okay, next up I read a book by Harlan Coben called I Will Find You. This is a thriller about a man who is put in prison for killing his son, and then somebody he knows comes into the prison and shows a picture of who they think is the son, and they're like, we think that he's still alive. And so this man decides to break out of prison to try to find his son. The most fun thing for me about Harlan Coben thrillers is like they're very twisty. There's a lot of twists and turns, and I am a sucker for like a prison break book. I love shows about, you know, breaking out of prison, movies about breaking out of prison, books about breaking out of prison. Bring it on! Like I'm always interested in that strategy. So I was like, okay, this sounds fine. There are other Harlan Coben books I would say that I have enjoyed more. Like I think that this was fine. This was like very typical Harlan Coben in terms of like thriller. But I think that there were some twists at the end that I kind of saw coming. And I was like, okay, you know, like I wasn't surprised, you know, like by where the book went. And some of the other stuff he's written, I don't know, it's just like a little more atmospheric than what I found this book to be. So for what it's worth, but this is, I think, one of his more recent ones. Okay, then I picked up a couple more of the books I had out from the library. So one of them is called What Works by Tara McMillan. This is a comprehensive framework to change the way we approach goal setting. And one of the things that Tara McMillan really tackles in this book is if you're very achievement oriented, she's trying to offer you like an alternative view of not just going after goals because you want to like check the box of like completing something, but thinking about it in just a different way, a more grounded way, maybe even like more values focused way. And one of the things that I think this author does really well, and I've followed Tara McMillan's work for quite a while. She's a blogger, she has a podcasting company, like she's done a number of things that I followed for a while. And actually at one point I was on her podcast. So, I mean, we had a connection that way. So I've been wanting to read her book for a while. And she does a really nice job of sharing kind of her own personal experiences with this book, but not in like a heavy-handed way. It's easy for you to apply what she's saying to your own situation. So this is one that I really enjoyed. And she also has a very lovely style of writing that I enjoyed that too. Then I picked up a book called Written, and this is by Beck Evans and Chris Smith. And it is about how to keep writing and build a habit that lasts. And so it's basically about structuring your writing like routines and habits. And it allows you to kind of do a little bit of like a diagnostic of yourself of like, what are the challenges that you encounter as a writer and how might you leverage different skills and strategies to write more consistently or effectively. I am not like in a place right now where I'm feeling like challenged in my own writing strategies and habits and things like that, but I could definitely see recommending this to someone if they were like, I need to kind of like reboot my writing practice, or I need to kind of understand how I can become like a more consistent writer over time. All right, next I picked up Claire Lombardo's Same as It Ever Was. This is one of the longer novels that I read in the month of August. I had a bunch of long novels on my list. And this is, I would call this like a suburban drama to some extent. It's about a woman who I think is like in her 50s. Her children are growing up. She's kind of like trying to figure out her like present state of her relationship with her partner. Like it's kind of just this like evolving story, and it goes back and forth between this relationship she had with this like neighbor of hers, a woman that they were like friends years ago, and then she like runs into this woman again, and it kind of like kicks her back into like remembering the past and like this kind of challenging time she went through in her marriage. And like it's just this like story about this family basically, but primarily about the mother in this family. I found this book to be, it would be a great book group read, I'll just say that to start. I also found it to just be like a very comforting read. Like it was well written and well plotted and good character development. Like sometimes you just, with a long novel, you just want to know that like you're in good hands basically, like as a reader. And that was definitely the case here. And I enjoyed this one. Okay, then I read on audio a book by Michael Gervais called The First Rule of Mastery, Stop Worrying About What People Think of You. And in this book, he basically talks about this concept of, I'm trying to remember the acronym he uses, but it's like it's a similar acronym to like FOMO, but he calls it like fear of people's opinions or something like that. So it's like FOPO. And he basically talks about, like how do you not have that be the thing that you're focused on? Like how do you just be living a life that is not focused on other people's opinions, but like on other reasons, other rationales for why you might take actions or move forward in a particular kind of way. This was a very fast read. I will say I don't remember a ton of details about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't helpful or interesting. But there were a lot of books I read this month. So it's not like rising to the surface in terms of the kinds of things that I read. But if that topic sounds interesting to you, I would recommend picking it up. I also read a book by Chloe Leese called Better Hate Than Never. This is the second book in the Wilmot Sisters series. And these are books that are based off of Shakespeare plays. And so every book is based off of a different Shakespeare play. And I had recently reread the first book because I knew I wanted to read the second book. And the second book is about a sister, so it's three sisters, they each have their own book. The third book I believe is coming out in early 2025 or like spring of 25. And in the first book, it's a sister who, I'm trying to remember the Shakespeare play. This one was Taming of the Shrew. I'm not remembering the first play. But basically, you had two sisters who were like in town and a third sister who was like out of the country in that first book. The second book is about the sister who was out of the country. So it's a character that like you weren't getting a ton of information about in the first book. And she basically develops a relationship and a romance with a childhood friend of the family. And I thought this was a solid addition to this series. I'm really looking forward to reading book 3. Next, I picked up a book by Brendon Burchard called High Performance Habits: How Extraordinary People Become That Way. And this is a book that explained to me, like I have a lot of people who will ask about like my level of productivity, which I don't talk about, you know, on this particular channel a whole lot, but like I have a job, I have a business, you know, I have a lot of things and I'm reading, you know, a ton. And so I get a lot done. And a lot of people will be like, how do you do that? This is one of the first books I've ever read that gave me a very good description that like the next time I get asked that question, I will say, you should read this book. Because there were a lot of habits that this author talked about that I was like, yes, that is something that like over time I have figured out works well to increase my productivity and like get a lot of things done. Now, I want to be like acknowledging that it's a little bit awkward to say that because like this talks about extraordinary people and I'm not saying I'm an extraordinary person. So I don't necessarily think that's true. However, the concept of like being a high performance person where you're like constantly knowing like what you're going to do next and what you're going to focus on and you're like checking a lot of things off your list, I identified with that a lot. And I felt like the descriptions that this author gave of like the things you need to do to live a life like that were right on. And there were just a lot of things that made a lot of sense to me. So if that's of interest to you and you're trying to kind of like up your productivity and think about what that could look like, I would highly, highly recommend this book. Okay, next I read a book called Creativity, Flow, and the Psychology of Discovery and Invention by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And this is a book I've been wanting to read forever. I've had a physical copy of it, I've had an audio copy of it, I think I have an ebook copy of it. Like I have been trying to read this book. And this author is a scholar, he's a psychologist, and he did this very large study with a bunch of graduate students supporting him where he interviewed all these creatives and then he pulls out like the things they have in common that make them creative. And he kind of builds this like taxonomy around creativity and what it means. Fascinating work. I've loved everything I've written by this person. I think that Flow is a book that just, it defines something that so many people understand and feel, you know, in their work. Flow is kind of like this optimal work experience where you like lose sense of time and, you know, you're really hitting the edge of like your capacity, you know, of working in a particular area. I loved that book. I loved this book. I would highly recommend it. I will say it's a study. So, I mean, like when you're reading it, keep in mind it's more of an academic text, I think, and it's written, I think, for a lay audience, like outside of higher ed as well. But it has a little bit of like a scholarly tinge to it. So be prepared for that. Okay, the next lengthy novel that I read is called All the Colors of the Dark by Chris Whitaker. And this is the second book that I have read by this author. And I would say if you're someone who reads, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about like prepping this video. If you're someone who reads like 10 books a year, I would make this one of your 10. Like this is one of the better books that I've read in a long time. It's long, it has great character development. It's basically about a serial killer. So it's got this kind of like thriller vibe to it, but it's not like a turn the pages kind of thriller. It's like you're kind of just sinking into the story over time. Great atmosphere, and great like tension in between characters who like care about each other deeply, but they're like on opposite sides of the law, basically. And so there's some stuff happening there that's really interesting. I would totally read this again. Like I think I have it, I don't know if I bought the audio or if I rented the audio from my library, but like I would absolutely read this book again. I really enjoyed it. It would be a great book club book as well. Okay, then I read a book called The Canary Code, A Guide to Neurodiversity, Dignity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work by Ludmila Preslova. I came across this book because I know someone who knows the author and she had posted about it on her social media and I was like, oh, that looks interesting, you know, given these books I've been reading around neurodiversity. And so I decided to pick it up. This book is very good at framing like a number of different studies and statistics and like really good like contextual information about neurodiversity at work. And it covers a couple different countries. You know, it talks about, I think, the UK, it talks about the United States. The challenge of this book for me, which is not the book's fault, is just that it's incredibly depressing. Like when you understand the state of like how people are treated who have neurodiversity, and like the percentage of, I think it's like 85% of people who are diagnosed with autism are not like in the workforce. I mean, like it is just a really high number. Like we're not making space very well, which is why this book is needed. Like it's very good in that regard, because it makes the case as to why we need to pay more attention to this and why we need to be more careful about how we're crafting our workspaces and crafting our job descriptions, and like making sure that we're opening up doors, you know, for people who identify in various forms of neurodiversity. But as I was reading it, I was like, this is kind of bleak, to just like face the facts of like how many people are not getting hired, are not progressing in the workplace, and are not really able to share what I'm sure are like their gifts, you know, with their organization because of just obstacles that are being put in the way. So it's a good book to read. And I thought about recommending it to like my HR leader, you know, at my organization, just because it's so good in that regard. But I did find it to be a little bit bleak too. So I'll just put that warning out there. Next up, I picked up The Girl Who Was Taken by Charlie Donley. And I have described, I think, Charlie Donley in the past. I've read several of this author's books as just having like some nice twists. They're typically thrillers. They typically have kind of an interesting premise. And in this particular one, there's basically a couple of girls, I think they're college age, and they both go missing at the same time. And one of them comes back and is like found, and the other one is not. And the sister of the one who is not is trying to figure out what happened. And there's another character, a man, who was like connected to them both, and he shows up dead, like his body is found. And so there's kind of this question of like, is there new evidence here? Like, what are we learning because of his situation and his death? And can we like open up the case again and kind of understand what happened to this sister who's been missing? This had a great ending. I'll just say that. Like I was like very invested by the time I got to the end of the book and like where this was going to go. I really liked the twist at the end of this one. I added, I think, another Charlie Donley to like my September reading pile. So I'm like just going through the backlist of this author because I find the book's really well plotted and really interesting. Okay, in August, I also picked up the third book in the Kindred's Curse series called Heat of the Everflame by Penn Cole. I read the first two books in the previous month, and I have read these in relatively quick succession. The first two books were shorter. The third book is like 1,000 pages long. I loved it. I thought it was super fun. I don't want to go into a ton of details because it just gives away all the stuff that happens in books 1 and 2. But just know that the series gets better over time, which I love to see. I hate when a series kind of like tanks a little bit, and this one is like ramping up. And the cliffhanger in book 3 was great. And I was like, where is book 4? Now, unfortunately, the author has not been clear about the timeline of the release of book 4 because she had given a date and then she wasn't able to meet the date for whatever reason. I don't know exactly what happened. And so Penn Cole has basically said it's coming, but I can't tell you when. And I'm not going to tell you when until it's like for sure, you know, that like this is when the book is coming out. I'm probably checking Penn Cole's social media like every other day to be like, have you announced this yet? When is this coming out? Like I'm very invested in reading book 4, partially because I don't want to forget everything that happened in books 1, 2, and 3. But I would definitely pick up the next book in this series, and it's completely worth the investment. And yeah, so you may check out my previous video to learn a little bit more about the series, but I really like book 3. The next book I read is another Alphabet Challenge book, His and Hers by Alice Feeney. This is a mystery thriller-esque type book that is basically about a police officer who is called to the scene of a woman who's been killed. And it turns out this is someone he had a previous relationship with, like the night before. Like they had just seen each other. And he was like, oh no, like they're gonna think this was me that did this. And he kind of comes under suspicion a little bit for this crime. And then the other main character is his ex-wife, who we're learning a little bit more about her, throughout this as well. And and she's a reporter, so she gets kind of pulled into the situation of the dead body. And then there's also a female detective who's like working alongside the male main character. Lots of twists, lots of turns, great red herring in the midst of like all of this. And the direction this takes, I thought, was actually like I didn't see it coming. Maybe I should have, but I didn't see it coming. And I thought it was a really fun twist. So this was a little bit more, it was kind of like a mix between like a police procedural and a thriller. So if that's something you're interested in, you might pick it up. Next, I picked up a very short book. It's like 75 pages. Maybe it's like a long essay you might think of, called Radically Condensed Instructions for Being Just As You Are by Jennifer Matthews. I don't even know where I came across this. Somebody like mentioned it on like a blog or something. And I was like, okay, let me just like quickly read this. The main thing I'll say about this is it's interesting, like what the author is putting together. It's definitely like coming from an academic space. And it's also very philosophical. So if you're someone who like reads that title and you're like, oh, that sounds interesting, and you're into like philosophy, I would definitely pick it up. I'm kind of like, I'm glad I read it, but like, I don't feel like I took like a ton away. It didn't feel very practical or concrete to me because of the philosophical nature of the argument of the author. Okay, next up, I read Scarcity Brain by Michael Easter. And this is about fix your craving mindset and rewire your habits to thrive with enough. And I thought this book was interesting. There were some examples in here that there was a lot about early in the book. There was a whole chapter on like gambling. There was also, chapters on topics around like eating and cravings and things like that. I will say that the other book I read recently by Michael Easter, which I'm just looking up to make sure I get it right, The Comfort Crisis, I thought was more interesting. This one felt a little bit more like science-y, and he was incorporating different studies and things like that. And The Comfort Crisis, I felt like he was really talking about like getting outside of your comfort zone in a way that didn't come up in this book as much. So I'm glad I read it, but I did like the other one better. So I would recommend that before I would recommend this one. Next up, I read a book called The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. And this is a book that some people have just raved and raved and raved about. It's basically the story of this older woman who's retired from being like a pirate, and someone comes and approaches her and is like, will you come back and like help me find, I think it's like my missing daughter, like I need help. And so she gets back into the game as a pirate. What I can say about this book is I can totally see why other people would love it. Piracy is just like not my thing. Like if you're super into like Pirates of the Caribbean and like the films and like that whole concept, like you would probably love this book. There's also some like mythology that she's woven in that I think is really like well done. Like this book is very well done. It just like didn't really hit for me. So I can absolutely recommend it if this is a topic that you enjoy, your fiction, but wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. Then I picked up another physical book from my library. I have quite the stack, so I've been working through it. It is called Leadership Shock by Pete Steinberg. And the subtitle is Using Authenticity to Navigate the Hidden Dangers of Career Success. I really loved this book. It basically talks about how when you get put into a new role of leadership, like if you kind of like take a leap into a new role of leadership, you have this experience of like, I'm not prepared for this. Like you don't have the skills, you don't have necessarily the experience, and you have to work through relatively quickly how to succeed in that new environment. And he calls this like leadership shock, that you kind of experience this like, I'm in a little bit of over my head, basically. He has some really concrete examples where he's like walking somebody through, basically coaching them through this situation and helping them figure out how to situate themselves as a leader. I was absolutely like journaling, like some of the stuff I was reading in this book, like it really like sparked some things for me in like my own leadership journey. I found it to be really interesting in terms of like what he was talking about with this concept. It reminded me a little bit of another book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which is another kind of leadership book that's like, don't ignore your blind spots. Like, just because you got this far doesn't mean you have the skills to get further. And just acknowledging like the humility of being a leader, and like you're never done. Like you need to keep learning, growing, trying new things, you know, like understanding that you don't have all that it takes to be successful, and that you're always trying to kind of upskill in that particular way. So I really, really like this one. Okay, then I read a book called The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, another Alphabet Challenge book, another really long novel. This book was, let me see how long it was. It was like 700 pages. Basically, this is a book that was great fall vibes. I'll start there because it's basically a book about Dracula and how Dracula is real. And it's kind of this like historical, like there's a historian, academic who's like researching this, and then his daughter like finds his papers, and then she's like going all around trying to figure out what's happening. And it's creepy. And it has a lot of just like very dark, like atmospheric scenes throughout this book. Very cinematic, if you want to think about it that way. What I would say though is, this is a hard one for me to recommend. It was well timed for me because I was like ready for fall vibes. And so I was like, ooh, this is like, I like the kind of atmosphere that's coming out of this book. It felt a little long, I'll say that. I don't know how to edit it down, but it felt really long. I listened to it on audio. The audio was good. It reminded me of like a lesser version of A.S. Byatt's Possession, which is another kind of like mystery, academic, like secrets being unveiled, but it takes place with like these poets and like the history of these poets. And I loved Possession. The novel is amazing. It was made into a film, which is also fine. But this book like reminded me a little bit of that. And so I think if this sounds interesting to you and you don't mind like taking the Dracula part out, I might recommend like Possession instead of The Historian, because I think Possession would still meet kind of that same criteria. It's not as creepy, obviously, but I don't know. It's just, it made me want to reread Possession when I read The Historian. So for whatever that's worth. Okay. Then I read a bunch of books, they're comics by Grant Snyder. I just like happened to pass upon Grant Snyder's work. I did not know this person before. He had a book that I started called The Art of Living: Reflections on Mindfulness and the Overexamined Life. And I was like, that sounds fun. And so it's basically a book of like comics. Like it's not even like a graphic novel. It's just like these individual pages of comics of him like talking about specific kinds of things. And that led me to another book he did called I Will Judge You by Your Bookshelf, which is basically another set of comics on like reading and books. Super fun. And then there's another book that he wrote called The Shape of Ideas, an illustrated exploration of creativity. So I was like, this person is like, you know, my kindred spirit, like without knowing anything about me. He's talking about mindfulness, he's talking about books, he's talking about creativity. And these are like three of my favorite topics in the world. So I went through each of these books. They're relatively short, maybe 150 pages. They read very quickly because they're just comics in terms of they don't have a lot of text. They're more visual. And he's got some other books. There's one on poetry, I think, that I'm planning to pick up and read soon as well. But these were just, again, fun, like kind of palate cleansers in the midst of everything else I was reading in the month. The next book I picked up is called The Work Happiness Method by Stella Grizont, and subtitle is Master the 8 Skills to Career Fulfillment. And there were a couple very concrete things that I took away from this book. She had a set of really nice, I would call them coaching questions around how to like reframe a situation that feels challenging that I actually like put into my journal so I could refer to it later. She also had a set of questions that were good ways of thinking about like visioning your future and kind of thinking through where you want to be in like 5 years. And I also kind of put those in my journal and tucked it away. I really, really like this book. I think that part of what I really connected with is I think this is a coach. I'm a coach. You know, she had a very coaching approach, you know, to how she was engaging in this topic. And I'm like super into career books right now. And so this one just, it hit, you know, at the right place for me. Okay, then I read a new author for me, a book called Consider Me by Becca Mack. This is the first book in the Playing for Keeps series. And I will also just mention, I picked up pretty quickly after this the second book in the series, and I ended up reading the second book as well, which is called Play With Me. Same author, Becca Mack. This is a book that kind of caught me off guard. I really, really enjoyed it. It's the story of a man who's a very famous hockey player, very wealthy, and he's basically like a playboy. Like he sleeps with a lot of different people. He is not interested in having a like monogamous or like steady relationship. And then he encounters the female main character, and she's like, nope, not interested. You're a playboy. You know, like she doesn't want to just be like one more, you know, person that he's sleeping with. And she's looking for something different. She's intrigued by him, but is like basically rejects him. And of course he's like not used to being rejected. And he becomes very intrigued with this woman. And they start to kind of like feel out what would it look like for them to have like an actual relationship, which he's like never done before. So he's trying to figure out what that means to like be in a relationship with this woman. And she's a high school gym teacher, and knows hockey, like has played hockey, but is like way more amateur, you know, in terms of her experience with that. I thought this was a great book. The second book in the series is about the sister of the male main character from the first book. And she has been very like protected by her older brother. And he's basically said to all of his friends, like, hands off, like, and he's been very kind of traditional, I guess I would say, and how he's tried to like protect her from like various things. But it's basically meant like she hasn't been in a relationship, and she's in college. And one of his hockey teammates they live in the same building together, the sister and this hockey teammate, and they start up a little bit of a romance. And they're having to like sneak around because of this older brother. And both of these books were just great. Like I think they're like 500 pages. Like I was just turning the pages. I really enjoyed them. There's a third and a fourth book in this series. The third book I'm really looking forward to because there's a male main character that shows up in books 1 and 2 that just seems like he just needs a romance. Like he's very kind and he was not treated well by his girlfriend, and he's the subject of book 3. So happy to dig into those, would recommend them. And I just found them to be like, there was a lot of heart in the characters, and I really enjoy that in the romances that I read. Okay, then I picked up another long novel called The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese. This is an author who's also very well known for a novel called Cutting for Stone, which I read and loved. And this author is just so incredibly talented. He is a medical doctor, and he brings that into his novels. Like there's always like this like interesting medical component. This was true of Cutting for Stone as well. And this is another really long one. Let me look and see how long it is. It's over 700 pages long. This needed 700 plus pages to like go through the story. It's multi-generational. It follows these families where like there's like this, I don't know what to call it. Like it's almost like a curse where one person in every generation dies by drowning. And so you go through like these different generations. This is really hard to describe because there's just a lot. There's a lot that's happening in this novel. Similar to All the Colors of the Dark, I would say if you only read like 10 books a year, this would be one that I would say like you could put this in as one of your 10 and I don't think you'd be disappointed. Takes place in India. The ending was so satisfying. It wraps up a lot of things that are like really interesting and took a turn that I was not expecting and not anticipating. And I also just really loved, like, again, the medical, like, it's not like a subplot, but it's definitely something that the author is like bringing into the narrative in like very intentional ways. I was blown away. Like, it's so good. It's really, really good. So that's all I'll say about that. Okay, then I picked up a book called Eastern Body, Western Mind by Anodea Judith. This is a book about the chakra system. And if you're not familiar with chakras, they're basically like, there is a spiritual practice, and this is often tied to yoga, where chakras are like energy centers of the body, and they're located in different parts of the body. And Anodea Judith is like one of the foremost experts on this concept because she has made a connection between the chakra systems and psychology. And so in this book, she's taking you through all the different chakra systems. She's describing the qualities of those systems. She's connecting it to different stages of like childhood into adulthood. She's talking about like the strengths, the shadow side. It's a little bit diagnostic in the sense of like, if you're struggling with this particular thing, you might want to work on your chakra, like your energy center in this particular kind of way. I do feel like I need to say, I don't know that I'm like 100% a believer in like the concept of chakra system. So I just want to put that out there, even though I've studied yoga as a practice and there's a lot that I have taken away from that. So this book is a lot, like there's a lot there. And one of the things that I could value in it, despite the fact that I wouldn't say I'm like 100% a believer in this, is there's so much room for like introspection as you're reading this book and thinking about the different areas of your life or like the different strengths or challenges that you are experiencing and thinking through them, even if you're not necessarily agreeing with like the lens of the concept of chakra systems. This book is a bit of an investment of time. I think it was like 500 pages, close to 500 pages. I listened to it on audio. I loved the audio. I thought it was really good. And also the author brings in a ton of different examples that I think are really helpful to help explain the concept. So if you are intrigued by this concept of chakra and like kind of energy centers and things like that, I would 100% recommend this book. And I might even read this again. Like there was just a lot to digest and a lot to take away. Okay, the last book that I picked up, actually I don't think this is the last book. Second to last book. I read one more book in August. Okay, second to last book that I read, another long novel that I was not planning to read, but I decided to pick up. It is called Age of Vice by Deepti Kapoor. This is a book that could be a standalone, but based on the ending, I think is not a standalone. I do not know of another book in this series, and actually let me see. It is not listed as a series in Goodreads. So, but the way that it ends on like a little bit of a cliffhanger. This is basically the story of a man. How do I even describe this? This is another really long one. How long was this book? It was over 500 pages. There's kind of like three main characters in this book. There's a man who becomes kind of a servant character. He grows up in like poverty and he gets picked up by this guy who's kind of like a crime lord. This is like a mafia book. That would be one way to describe this. It's like a mafia book that takes place in India. So there's some violence in there. And so there's this character who's kind of like a servant character. There's the mafia like crime lord, or he's like the son of the crime lord, but he's another main character. And then there's this woman who is like a reporter. And the chapters go back and forth between like these three different characters. This is another book. This should be obvious. When you have a really long novel, there's just a lot going on. Hard to describe. I guess what I would say about this book is another one that I can say incredibly well done. There's a lot of people who just love this book and they love the concept of this book. Similar to the pirate book, mafia books are not really my thing. And so if you are someone who enjoys that, and I've read a couple mafia books over the last few years that like, they hit just right because they were like more on the mystery side, or there was some other kind of like genre mashup that like made it work for me. But I don't typically look for like mafia books or even like mafia films. Like these are not necessarily things that I connect with. Part of it, I think, is just because there can often be just a lot of gratuitous violence, and that's not something that I necessarily seek out. But this book was very well crafted and very well done. And I can recognize that even in acknowledging that it's not quite for me, like plot-wise. So would recommend this one if any of that is sounding interesting to you and you want to do a deeper dive. Okay, the last book that I read, I believe this was also an Alphabet Challenge book, is called Heartless Hunter by Kristen Cicerelli. This is the first book in the Crimson Moth series. There is a second book that is coming out. Let me see when the second book is coming out. It is coming out in early 2025, February 2025. This book was a little over 400 pages. You can see I'm like trying to gather my thoughts on this book. Basically, this like basic premise of the plot, you have a witch and you have a witch hunter, and they're like enemies to lovers. The witch is someone who there's like a society where there used to be witches, and they used to just like operate in society, and then there was like this rebellion, and then all the witches like have become criminals, and they're trying to like wipe them out. And so if you're a witch, you got to hide that you're a witch. And so there's this woman, I would say she's like late teens, early 20s, and she is called the Crimson Moth, and she is basically helping witches to evade capture from the guard. And then the male main character is the older brother of this female main character's best friend, who she's known and kind of grown up with, and he's in the guard. The challenge for me with this book, like, really enjoyed the world building, really enjoyed the concept of witches and witch hunters. Like, there was a lot here that I liked, and I was like, yep, this is like checking the boxes. I like the fantasy, elements of it. The magic system was really fun. The challenge for me was the relationship between the female main character and the male main character. It just needed something else. And I'm not entirely sure if I can articulate what it was. I feel like I almost wanted this book to be longer. Like, I feel like there was something about their character development and the relationship where they're kind of like playing off of each other, because he suspects her of being the Crimson Moth and she suspects him of suspecting her. And so there's kind of this like tension that's building throughout the book, which was good. And that made a lot of sense. But it's like, I needed more of their like relationship development, because it felt like it just like there were points in the book where things happened that I was like, it just felt a little unbelievable because of the way their relationship was developing over time. Great cliffhanger at the end of the book. I would probably pick up the second one in the series just to kind of see where it goes. But I feel like it was a little bit of a miss for me in terms of that relationship. And that, I guess that's what I've liked so much about the Kindred's Curse series, is like it's taking its time to like really develop the relationships and to make sure that they're like solid and they make sense. And I didn't feel like this one did that. And that felt unfortunate because I liked so much else about this book. So I would recommend it. But that was one part that felt a little bit harder for me. Okay, those are all of the books that I read in the month of August. A lot of really good ones in there. And I hope you'll stay tuned to see what I'm hoping to read in the month of September, which is a video coming up soon. And in the meantime, happy reading.